This is the first of 3 videos on democracy in a globalized world. This first video will go over the concept of globalization. Now, Chapter 11 of the Held textbook considers the meaning of globalization for modern democracy and how it might be possible to construct regional and global institutions to work alongside democratic autonomy within the nation-state. This chapter assumes that the model of democratic autonomy at the national level may not be enough to give citizens a genuine degree of democratic control over the forces that shape their lives. It seems clear from the chapter, as well as from what is happening today with the pandemic, that there needs to be a model of democracy along with international institutions to cope with global crises such as this current pandemic, but also things like climate change, and to deal with those things that do not respect national borders. Like his model of democratic autonomy, Held's model of cosmopolitan democracy is only one possible idea, and these ideas may stimulate in you some thinking about how we should move forward in creating an improved model of democracy that can mitigate the existing problems with current forms of democracy. So let's start with this question of what is globalization. Held talks about it on pages 293 and 294. Now, different theorists will approach this question in different ways. For example, some historians place the roots of globalization as in the period from about 1870 to 1914, calling this period the first age of globalization, which means that we're currently in the second age of globalization. And maybe we'll be seeing the third age coming up. Now, globalization has been far more resilient and socially embedded than many people have acknowledged in the past. And it seems clear that it's unlikely to go away unless we completely lose the technological capacity to move goods and people around the world. Even though the current pandemic has stopped most travel for the moment, it's unlikely that travel will disappear completely in the long term. But what we might see is a new form of globalization. Now, there's different understandings of globalization. In particular, many that you've probably seen focus on an economic version of globalization. Now, economic globalization is about the emergence and operation of a single worldwide economy. So here we can see that globalization generates emergent tendencies or systemic properties such that the world economy increasingly operates as a singular connected system. In other words, as a result of globalization, we're seeing a shift in the structure of the economy, a structural shift in the economy where borders are essentially dissolved so that there's less distinction between the domestic economy and the world economy. And any distinctions that do exist are increasingly becoming problematic. Now, this has been facilitated by things like information technologies and infrastructures of communication and transportation, which has led to what some people called a time-space compression or a shrinking world. Now, this time-space compression results in the things that we've seen, like economic shocks in one country spreading rapidly to other locations. So what we can see sometimes is that globalization involves a rescaling of economic space. Globalization also tends to create a sort of a denationalization of economic relations. In other words, we've been moving away from the nation as the primary economic union to the global. And we can also say that globalization generates emergent tendencies or systemic properties. As I said, we're seeing more and more interconnections. So this is where we can say that this kind of rescaling is an uneven process. But remember, this is something that's continually evolving. Now, Held does not focus on the economic version of globalization. He argues that globalization is, in fact, a multidimensional process involving the economic, of course, but also the political, the technological, the military, legal, cultural, and environmental. Although few discussions will ignore the economic dimension, we need to be careful that we don't privilege the economic over other things like the social and the personal. We don't want to ignore these other dimensions of globalization. We can see globalization as a historical process rather than something that's a fixed outcome or condition. So, in this sense, globalization is about the widening, deepening, and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness. Now, although the speed of change in information spread is facilitated by new technologies that often make globalization feel like it's inevitable, it really isn't. Globalization can be controlled. This is that tongue twister again. Globalization is what politicians and social forces wish to make of it. They make decisions, right? They make decisions about how things are going to look, what policies to implement, and so on. Therefore, politics will define the future trajectories of globalization and the global economy. And there really are no guarantees about where globalization will go next. Just a couple notes here. Globalization is not just about growing integration. It can also be about global disruptions and fragmentations, which may be what we're seeing today with the pandemic. So we don't know yet what supply chains will be disrupted or how the economies will be impacted in the long term. What history tells us, however, is that such disruptions can weaken old political and economic structures. So to me, this means that we need to pay attention to the decisions that our leaders are making right now. They shouldn't just be reacting. We need to be thinking ahead and planning for what's going to come next, not just reacting to the immediate. For example, if we think that the world is already one integrated community, we might hope that all people around the world will be able to share in the individual human rights that are promised by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. Now, one of the fears, though, that too much of this integration, that too much of a one world idea, is that a one world system might end up being exclusionary, that one culture might dominate over all the rest, or that a quote unquote superior culture might rule over everyone else. And so in this view, this critique of this sort of one world closer integration is that we might see the demise of many cultures. And this is certainly something we've been seeing happen over the years. I'm going to pause here, and the next video will go over ideas about the impact of globalization on modern democracy.